Story 1. I was working in project management for my company, and because I was quite young, back then 24 male, I often got misjudged and people didn't take me seriously. Imagine a guy looking very young, quite slim, usually not very loud, all in all average. So we started a new project at that time, for which I was assigned project manager, my very first time officially so. At that time, we mostly did work from home, and because we didn't have video calls, just regular phones, not many people knew me and my face. Also, the project with around 50 people didn't make the situation easier. So because of a delay in a sub-project and other things, we had a meeting with the responsible people. We tried email in the past, but man, those guys were resistant to friendly reminders. Hence the meeting, and I made sure we had the meeting in person. Colleagues made the experience. If you want people to do what you want, and they are a bit resistant, meet in person. I could have easily snapped a finger and had the responsible guys replaced, but firstly, I did not have the self-esteem to pull that off. Secondly, that's not my style, and thirdly, I wanted things to go smoothly, not start a war. I was a bit early, but people were already in the room, mostly chatting, which was a good sign, because a good mood is important and makes the whole thing easier. Also, this meeting was set up to take a couple hours. Meet Chad. He was the troublemaker, and I made sure to know everything about him there was to know, asked colleagues, etc. He thought the project was unnecessary, a waste of time and below his skill. He didn't choose to participate. The project was assigned to him because of his year-long knowledge, and he made sure to let everybody know he was the best. Although not being a fan of the project, he started to enjoy the benefits of being in his position because he was assigned a few people and he could command them as he pleased. I heard he was a little bit of a dictator there. I'm sorry if this is not the most objective view, but since I've met him, I really do not like or respect him. I entered the room, walked up to him to greet him, but before I could say anything, he shut me down. "Don't you see I'm busy talking, oof?" I was startled. "We can talk after the meeting, just sit and listen. Oh, and if you could bring me a coffee, that would be nice." He continued to bark at me. That's odd. I still didn't know what to say, so I just turned around and left him, going to get a coffee. In hindsight, I didn't know why, I was just so surprised. I was like, what? I need a minute. Colleagues later told me the confusion was really showing in my face. They too were a little confused about what just had happened. Walking out of the door, I meet a young guy, bringing coffee, wearing the same colored shirt as I do, and then it hits me. Chad must have mistaken me with one of his juniors. I chuckled and talked to the junior. "I like your shirt," was a good starter, and after a few sentences, he could confirm my theory. I had an idea and took the coffee duty off the junior and took it into my own hands. Took the coffee, went back into the room. My colleagues were seriously questioning what I was doing. I could see it on their faces. I walked up to Chad, "Coffee with me." "So, Mr. Chad, here is your coffee." "Thanks, Junior." "Wait, where is Junior?" He was confused. He did not know me or my face. I have never had a meeting with him. He started to get a bit snarky too, probably to vent and also to hide his embarrassment. "Also, where is Mr. Project Manager? I have important meetings following." I grinned and said, "Oh, Mr. Project Manager was just getting a coffee, but I think we can start soon." Left him sitting, went around the table, sat on my place and spoke louder to make sure everybody noticed we were starting. Chad turns around, sees who introduces himself to the group as the project manager, me, who he commanded to bring his coffee. He, being the Chad he was, started to smile. I could see he was surprised, but also him thinking, I just told this guy to get me my coffee, I can control him too. That's where the war I tried to avoid started. Whatever idea my team brought up, he said was impossible to do. When asking him what he needed, he made implausible and highly overestimated guesses. He started to criticize the project and project management. Said the staffing was bad and how anybody in their right mind could put a person like me in this position. I can only assume he meant my age and my weak response. It was amazing how brutally unfiltered he just attacked me, not willing to let me speak. I tried to stay calm, My colleague really was helping me there. After what felt like at least half an hour of him ranting, making demands and attacking, I decided I will not negotiate with terrorists. Mr. Chad, we can end this meeting right here. I can see it is highly unproductive, and if you think you can waste everybody's time like you did when you commanded me to bring coffee, you are highly mistaken. I expect your results in time, and I will make sure your bonus is dependent on you meeting your deadlines. I have already set up a meeting with your boss. I hadn't yet, but that was unimportant also. While we are at it, I'd like to offer your coffee junior to start working with my team at project management. I'm sure that learning how to make your coffee is a waste of money and potential. If anybody else on your team wants to join, they are more than welcome. But just to make this clear, I don't offer them anything besides not barking at them and them actually doing their jobs. And with that I stood up, went over to Chad, took his coffee because as I had made it, it was mine, and left the meeting, still quite in rage. A petty move in hindsight, but I did really not care. Had to get some air after that and reflected with my colleagues what had just happened and how I could have handled it without taking his coffee. A few days later, Chad's whole team worked under my direct supervision, and in order to get the project running again, I put them back together in a team. Suddenly deadlines were easily met, problems solved. Fun times. I don't know what happened to Chad, I never checked. Sometimes my colleagues still ask me, command me to make them coffee. Story 2. As I mentioned in an earlier post, my mother works in a public pharmacy that provides for home care teams. This means they handle a significant amount of patient information and controlled medications. Unfortunately, my mother often finds herself working alongside entitled nurses and doctors, as well as some truly careless colleagues, in addition to dealing with the notorious Mega Karen. Within the administrative staff, there was once a malpractice of fulfilling any nurse or doctor's request, even for controlled medications, without proper authorization. However, the state introduced a new system requiring every request to be registered under the doctor's login and recorded on the admin's login for tracking and delivery. Despite this, some of her colleagues would often cave under pressure from nurses or simply disregard the new system altogether, opting to bypass these protocols. Thankfully, my mother has always insisted on online forms for requests, ensuring she remains uninvolved in these irregularities. Recently, with a new supervisor taking over, adherence to these policies has become stricter. Then, a significant issue arose. A nurse administered morphine to an elderly patient, resulting in a severe allergic reaction that nearly cost the woman her life. She was hospitalized and had to be resuscitated, but thankfully, she survived. This incident sparked a full-scale investigation. It was revealed that the morphine was not requested through the proper channels. When questioned, the nurse admitted obtaining the morphine from my mother's pharmacy. Investigators sought the logs since morphine is not supposed to be dispensed without proper documentation. However, the delivery was unregistered, indicating it had been handed over informally. No one stepped forward to take responsibility. Had the individual responsible for dispensing the morphine checked the patient's log, as required by protocol, they would have known that the patient was allergic to morphine. Furthermore, the log would have shown that there was no medical request for morphine for this patient at that time. Instead, the nurse made an assumption, and the admin staff facilitated it by bypassing the system. As a result, the elderly woman and her family bore the consequences of their negligence. The aftermath was far from satisfactory. The patient's doctor protected the nurse by retroactively submitting a request into the system. Since no admin admitted fault and there were no security cameras, no one could be held accountable even though the inventory showed a discrepancy in the amount of morphine available. The supervisor, understandably upset, has since taken decisive action. She is implementing stricter measures, including a signed agreement for all administrative staff outlining proper medication handling procedures. Anyone who fails to comply risks termination. Perhaps this will finally lead to Karen's departure. Despite these changes, the toxic environment persists. Nurses often complain about wanting certain medications without following proper procedures. The process isn't even particularly difficult. Doctors simply need to submit an official request, which the system automatically approves. Interestingly, the nurses have stopped pestering my mother or the pharmacist, instead targeting younger male colleagues or Karen, who are more likely to bend the rules. Meanwhile, some of my mother's colleagues continue to grumble about the new rules and the supervisor's insistence on accountability, as though trying to enforce proper practices makes her the villain. The irresponsibility of some staff members is alarming, especially considering the impact their actions have on patients' lives. My mother has repeatedly noticed discrepancies in the medicine cabinets after meticulously accounting for everything before her days off. She has even found sterilized products with ripped packaging being placed into kits instead of being discarded properly. The workplace remains a chaotic and toxic environment. At least my mother has taken precautions by changing all her passwords, ensuring no one can log into her account to submit fraudulent orders. She was particularly wary of Karen, whose recent overly friendly behavior raised suspicions. Story 3. So, here is my story. Back in May of 1990, there was an unseasonably late snowstorm. A few days after it snowed, I was riding my bike and found a baby duckling all by itself near a river. There was no mother duck around, so I put it inside my shirt to keep it warm and brought it home on my bike. My mother thought it would die because it was so small and cold and wet and shivering, but I put it under a light, and after a while it dried off and started hopping around and peeping. It was so cute, it followed me like a puppy. I called it Philip, because it sounded like it was saying Philip, Philip, Philip whenever it peeped. So, after a few weeks, I figured I ought to teach it to swim and eat stuff in the lakes, so I started bringing it to a small local beach. Philip did well. He swam around and ate weeds and snails, and everyone at the beach loved him. Now my trouble started. After I had brought Philip to the beach several times, the lifeguard told me that his boss, the director of Parks and Recreation, who will be known as Stuffed Shirt, had told him that there was a city ordinance against bringing pets to city parks. I tried to explain to the lifeguard that it was only for a few weeks, and then the duck would be grown up and able to live on its own, but he didn't care. I was upset. How was I going to teach the duck to live on its own? I went to the library and got out the large blue books of city ordinances and looked up the relative ordinance and discovered something interesting. There was one ordinance that prohibited bringing dogs into city parks, and another that prohibited bringing horses into city parks, both of which I see happening fairly often, BTW, but no ordinance against bringing ducks into city parks. So, I went home and called Stuffed Shirt. However, it being a weekend, he wasn't in, so his secretary answered the phone. I told her what had happened and what the ordinances actually said, and told her to tell Stuffed Shirt that I would be bringing my duck to the beach any time I felt like it. Well, apparently when Stuffed Shirt heard this, his head exploded. He called me back and told me that he had had a conference with the city attorney about my duck, and according to him, the city attorney had decided that the law should be interpreted to refer to all domestic or pet animals, not merely dogs or horses. Then he said he had called the DNR because I was not supposed to have a duck. Now, please note the following at this point. Attorneys are not privileged to interpret the law. Only judges are supposed to do that, and the law was not ambiguous such that it required interpretation. One specifically said dogs, the other specifically said horses. Note that at this point, my duck was referred to as a domestic animal. Anyway, a few days later the DNR agent shows up at my house and marches right into my backyard, without ringing the doorbell and without a warrant. We will call him Butt Buddy, because I suspect that was his relation to Stuffed Shirt, as he wasn't even from my city. Stuffed Shirt had gotten him to come over from another city. I was in my backyard at the time feeding Philip, my duck, and Butt Buddy proceeded to read me the riot act. First he told me that my duck was a wood duck, which is a wild animal, after Stuffed Shirt had previously referred to it as a domestic animal. And this was a lie. By the way, I learned later my duck was a mallard, which can be considered either wild or domestic, depending on the circumstances. Then he tells me that I can't have a wood duck, which my duck wasn't, without a game farm license, and that I couldn't get a game farm license unless I had 40 acres of land. He then told me that I either had to let my duck go by the end of the day, or he would confiscate it and take it to a lake in another town, where I would never see it again. I told him my duck was too little to let go, and I was going to let it go in a month, but he wouldn't hear it. He told me I had to do as I told him. I was crying as I let my poor little duckling Philip go on the lake. I went back that evening to check on him, and he was cowering, terrified, under a boardwalk. The next day, I couldn't find him at all. He probably got eaten by something because he was way too little to let go. Then, would you believe, the next week, Buddy the game warden came back onto my property, without permission, again, to make sure the duck was not still there. Now, on to the revenge part. After losing my duck, I went to the library and spent hours looking up the laws about wildlife and game farms, and I found out something very interesting. But Buddy, the game warden, had lied to me. As it turned out, you only needed 40 acres of land to get a game farm license on land where hunting, trapping, or killing of animals was going on. Otherwise, there was no land requirement to get a game farm license, only a pen size requirement, which my pen for my duckling more than met. If I was devastated and crying my eyes out before, now I was so furious that my head was exploding. They killed my duck not because it was the law, but just for an ego trip. So I got even. I was the town eccentric, so I didn't have any reputation to lose, and didn't care what people thought of me. I spent the next several weeks walking around downtown and telling everyone who would stop and listen about my duck, and how Stuffed Shirt and Buddy had lied to me and made me condemn my own pet to death. Maybe people thought I was nuts, but I didn't care. Everyone was finding out what happened and Stuffed Shirt was scared. I had a friend from work who also worked part-time in his office, and she told me he was so frightened that he had gone to a lawyer to try to pursue a slander charge against me to get me to stop telling people what had happened. Only the lawyer told him there was absolutely nothing that could be done, because truth was an absolute defense against slander. And if he didn't like the truth, whose fault was that? Stuffed Shirt's critical mistake, of course, was actually filing a complaint with the DNR so that he could get Buddy game warden to legitimately intimidate me into releasing my baby duckling way too soon. The DNR, like all government agencies, keeps records. If he tried to claim I was lying and slandering him, there was documented proof of what had happened. So the outcome? Stuffed Shirt lost his cushy city bureaucrat job as the director of Parks and Recreation. And the last I heard of him, about 10 years after this happened, had lost 2 other jobs. His house. He couldn't make the payments when he had no job. His wife, who didn't want to stick around when he had no job, and was somewhere in a trailer park, drinking himself to death. Story 4. I guess I should start by explaining how I ended up in this mess. Growing up in a rough neighborhood meant you had to be careful about who you associated with, but also who you crossed. I wasn't exactly what you'd call a troublemaker, just a regular teenager trying to navigate high school without too much drama. My grades were decent, and I mostly kept to myself, except for one close friend who happened to be part of what you might call an organized group of guys. Not exactly a gang, but definitely more than just regular friends hanging out. My friend and I had known each other since middle school, way before he got involved with his group. He was always there for me when I needed someone to talk to, and I never judged him for his choices. The rest of the school knew we were friends, and usually that was enough to keep anyone from bothering me. But then came that day in September. I was walking my German Shepherd, Max, along our usual route when this guy came out of nowhere. He was tall, probably in his mid-20s, with a face that spelled trouble. He started yelling at me, asking if I was friends with that piece of trash from the South Side. When I tried playing dumb and denied knowing what he was talking about, things got ugly fast. Before I could even process what was happening, his fist connected with my face. I felt the crunch of my nose breaking, and warm blood started flowing down my face. Max started barking and lunging at him, which gave me enough time to stumble backward and run away. My lip was split open, and my whole face felt like it was on fire. As soon as I got home, I called my friend and told him about getting jumped because of him. He asked if I was okay and wanted to know exactly what happened. After I explained everything, he got quiet for a moment. He then explained that it was probably someone from the rival group, saying they'd been causing trouble lately. He assured me they would handle it. A week later, my friend showed me his phone. He asked me to look at a photo to identify if it was the same guy who attacked me. The photo showed the same man attacking someone else, someone I recognized from my friend's group. My stomach dropped when I saw that familiar face. I confirmed it was definitely him, and my friend grimly informed me they knew where this guy usually hung out, promising he would regret ever touching me. 2 days later, I was hanging out with my friend and his group when we spotted him walking down the street. Everything happened so fast. The guys rushed him, and I found myself joining in. All my anger from that day came flooding back as I watched him get what he deserved. My friend pulled out a knife, holding it close to the attacker's face. He threatened the guy, telling him that if he ever messed with any of us again, the knife wouldn't stay in his pocket. The guy was terrified, blood dripping from his nose just like mine had been. That's when I remembered something that could make this even better. I casually mentioned that Officer Johnson lived in one of the nearby houses. I knew the local police officer lived nearby, and I also knew this guy was dealing drugs. The look of panic on his face was priceless. The police arrived within minutes. They found not just the drugs, but also an illegal firearm. But the best part? This genius was actually wanted for murdering one of my friend's group members a few months back. They had been looking for him for weeks. He got sentenced to 15 years. The cherry on top? He ended up in the same prison as my friend's older brother, who was serving time for an unrelated offense. Let's just say his prison experience hasn't been pleasant. The last I heard, he had tried requesting a transfer to another facility, but it was denied. Karma really does come back around, doesn't it? Every time I walk Max now, I can't help but smile, knowing that one random act of violence led to this guy's whole world crumbling down. Play stupid games, win stupid prizes. Story 5. This happened about 4 years ago when my parents wanted to go to New York, but couldn't because they have 7 kids including me. We live on a farm and are homeschooled. Being the second eldest, I was in charge of teaching my younger siblings, as well as myself. Usually we would finish school at noonish if we started early enough. The reason that my older brother was not with us is because he decided to go to high school. My mom decided to call her childhood nanny to see if she was available, and of course she is. Everything goes according to plan, and she is left alone with us. We finish our schoolwork and go outside and do what kids do. I was 15 at the time, and my siblings ranged from 3 years old. We are roughhousing and jumping with our 3-year-old brother on our trampoline. She does not like this. She comes out yelling in Spanish that we didn't have permission to be outside. We live in a predominantly Hispanic area, 2 kilometers from the US-Mexico border. But most people we meet are either bilingual or just speak English. We just speak English. My sister and I barely understand what she is conveying. She then comes and scolds in Spanglish, meaning Spanish English. We should not be slacking off and take care of our school. We try to tell her that we were done with our school for the day, but refuses to talk to us because we don't speak Spanish. This does not float well with us, especially because we are free-spirited farm kids with 600 acres, about 2.5 square kilometers, of pecan trees to roam. So she puts us in the schoolroom and leaves to go finish cooking lunch. My 9-year-old sister starts throwing a tantrum because she wanted to be on the trampoline. This causes my little brother to start crying. Me being the oldest makes eye contact with my other sister, who is 14 years old, and we are both thinking the same thing. We tell the kids to be quiet and that we were going to leave after lunch. This almost instantly calms them down. Simultaneously, I leave the schoolroom and tell the nanny that I have to use the restroom. She simply says "Andel," which means to hurry up. I go to my room and grab my good tennis shoes and a backpack. Then go to my little brother's room and grab wipes and diapers just in case. He is potty trained, but you never know. I walk back through the kitchen, hiding the bag best I can, and make it past her flawlessly to the pantry, which is around the corner from the kitchen. I grabbed a whole bunch of apples, bananas, and pears, and threw them in the bag, left the pantry and went back to the schoolroom. With impeccable timing, she then calls us to the kitchen to eat lunch. She gave us sopa, and that's it, just sopa. For those of you who don't know, sopa is like watery rice. It's a bomb, don't get me wrong. But feeding a whole bunch of kids a single bowl of sopa and not allowing them to get any more is not very filling. We act like it's fine, except for my 9-year-old sister and my little brother, who say they want more. She responds with a simple no before they start crying. We quickly grab them and tell them that it's all okay to remember what we said earlier. The youngest brother was a little bit harder to convince though. After we finished, we went back to the schoolroom, opened one of the windows, quietly removed the screen, and all of us started climbing out the window. Our plan was to walk to my grandma's house, which is about a mile 1.6 kilometers away, which we've done numerous times, but without our baby brother. I just realized that this whole part is the first day, so I'm gonna fast forward the rest of the week. Just imagine her cussing us out in Spanish when we get home, and when my little brother goes to lay down for a nap and starts crying. She beats the crap out of him with a belt on the 5th day. After I hear her going ham on my brother, I'm at my wit's end. She walks out of his room, and we're face to face. I was taller than her at the time, due to the fact that I was abnormally tall for my age, and she was abnormally short. She tells me to move and yells in my face. While she was still holding the belt, I got so angry that I sucker punched her right in the eye socket, and she went down. When she got up holding her head, she was crying profusely. I felt no remorse. I spat in her face. To this day, I do not regret that. My parents got home the next day, grounded me and forced me to work on the farm instead of doing schoolwork. I didn't mind it much because I'd rather be hoeing weeds out in a ditch than doing school. You thought that was the end? This is just where it gets spicy. About 3 months later, my parents want to take another vacation, but this time it's on business to Atlanta, Georgia. They didn't want me to break the nanny's eye socket again, so they took me to my grandma's house that was approximately 40 minutes away from our house. Not the same grandma's house that was mentioned in the beginning of the story. I would get daily calls from all my siblings crying about how horrible she is. About 3 days in, the calls stop. I don't really pay much attention to this as I'm preoccupied doing chores for my grandparents. I later found out that she took the home base of our home phone and hid it because my siblings were making too many calls. Apparently my sister, who is 9 years old, witnessed her hit herself repeatedly in the side of the head, take pictures of it with her phone, and send it to my parents. She claimed that my sister, R, who is 14 years old, hit her in the head. My parents obviously knew something was up because my sister wouldn't hurt a fly. They had to end their business venture early and returned home and kicked the nanny out of the house. My mom got the stories from all of us, including me, and concluded that I never hit her, and that my sister never hit her. Me being the intelligent little 15-year-old I was, exclaimed to my parents that I wanted charges to be pressed against her. My parents refused to press charges against her for some odd reason. So I took matters into my own hands, and I called the cops on her, and claimed that she was an illegal alien, harboring herself in the US. What I didn't know is that she actually freaking was. I just wanted to get her in trouble, but ended up making her lose her entire livelihood, and she was deported back to Mexico. Story 6. So this story took place back in my late high school days and involves my old friend Jack. I'm a huge nerd. I watch anime, cartoons, superhero movies, play video games, and all that stuff, and Jack was the same way. Jack and I would always go to his house and watch anime and cartoons, and we would have a good time. The only downside to it was that Jack had to share a house with his stepfather Chuck, who wasn't really fond of Jack or me, and the feeling was mutual. Chuck was one of those people that believed that anything that wasn't grounded in reality was stupid kid stuff, and anyone that watches those kinds of things were immature and stupid. Never mind that he would sit on the couch for hours watching reality television. More often than not, whenever Jack and I were sitting in his room, watching a show, he'd barge in making a commotion about us always watching the things that we watch, and would say something to the effect of, "Why don't you idiots watch something real instead of this nonsense?" Or, "You idiots would be a lot smarter if you watched something else." Jack would always wheel on him for saying those things. An argument would ensue, and I was forced to leave. I always hated Chuck for that reason, and wanted to find some way to get back at him for a while. But it really wasn't my place to say or do anything, so I just kept quiet. Until one day Jack told me some very interesting information about old Chuck. It turns out that Chuck never made it through high school and flunked out in 9th grade. At first I thought Jack was joking, but he explained to me that his mom told him never to bring it up as Chuck was very sensitive about the issue. So not only was this guy a jerk, he was a complete hypocrite. Jack and I were much further along than he ever got, and he wanted to call us idiots. I knew there was no way I could let that slide, and so Jack and I devised a sneaky plan to expose him for his crap. What Chuck didn't know was that in addition to nerd stuff, we were also really into political stuff as well. For context, this happened in 2016 when the presidential election was going on. Jack and I would normally restrict those conversations to school, as there were much more people involved in the discussion, and it was more fun that way. But Jack and I devised a plan where he would invite some of our other friends over to talk about it. Jack knew for a fact that Chuck couldn't make heads or tails about politics, since he said one time his mom was watching CNN when he promptly changed the channel saying, "Why are you watching this? You know I don't understand any of this." So we were all in Jack's room, and Jack slyly brought up politics, and our friends dove right into the discussion, completely unaware of our plans. As usual, Chuck barged into the room to see what was going on, and you can imagine the level of surprise he had seeing a bunch of high school students saying, "Blah blah something something politics." When he saw us and heard what we were talking about, the look on his face was priceless. He asked what we were up to, and Jack replied with, "Oh, we're simply discussing the proposals that will supposedly increase the economic status of the U.S." Old Chuck was totally frazzled and replied with, What?" Then I chimed in saying, "I personally think that the claims are way out there," and go on to quote a bunch of statistics, dates and percentages and all that. Chuck was absolutely dazed. All of our friends that were there gave their quick 2 cents as well. Chuck was completely speechless. Jack then shot Chuck with the $1 million question. "So what's your stance on the elections overall?" Everyone just went silent and started staring Chuck down with anticipation. Chuck's face went bright red, and he couldn't utter a word. Chuck almost immediately ran out the room, slamming the door, and Jack and I burst out laughing. This would have probably been enough to get the point across to Chuck, but Jack and I didn't stop there. After that, the next day at school, we filled our buddies in on the plan, and we decided to make it a regular thing. Every day after school, we'd go to Jack's house and talk about politics nonstop. We'd watch news highlights together and talk in lengthy detail about everything they brought up in the video. We made sure to leave the door slightly open so that Chuck would hear everything we're talking about, and made especially sure to ask him about whatever they're talking about in the video whenever he decided to make an appearance. This would go on for a few weeks until one day Jack sat us down and told us that he overheard Chuck saying to his mom that he wants her to tell him to stop inviting us over to talk about politics, because it's all we ever talk about, and we keep asking him stuff he knows nothing about, and it's making him feel like an idiot. We all high-five and laugh at our success. Jack had moved away since graduation, but I recently found out that we'd be attending the same university as I bumped into him on campus when I was submitting my application. We got a catching up when he brought this story up, and we had a good laugh about it. So I thought I'd post it here and see what you guys think.